Okay, so this video is to record basically some of the common mistakes that you have made while I mark your assignment. So, number one, I think a handful of you just copy and paste what you have read from the notes and without really internalizing or digesting how the whole taxation process work. So many of you were purely stating what you copy without really the explanation. So there are also quite a handful of you with no diagram. So number one, when you are explaining taxation, you do need to remember you need to have a diagram in your explanation. So this is a must whenever you are explaining how taxation work to correct market failure issues. Okay, so there were also quite a few students who wrote the word internalize the external costs, making external costs part of the private cost. The biggest issue that I have with such a statement is the real, like, how do you internalize the external cost and make the external cost part of the whole private cost. So in helping you to understand what all this means, I actually drew a diagram over here. So we already went through the case study and we know that the whole issue is about the fizzy drinks that are being consumed contributing to the diabetes and the obesity issue, right? So when we are drawing this diagram, we must already, number one, take note whose perspective are we looking from. So it must be from the perspective of the consumers, which I already highlighted over here. So if it is the perspective of the consumers, the private cost and the private benefit has to come from the consumer's perspective. So these are the private costs as well as the private benefit of the consumers. So number one, when you're explaining the diagram, you need to tell me how much do you tax. So the amount of taxation is equivalent to the amount of external cost at the QS level. So the one that is in orange is the amount of tax that's being levied. Okay, so subsequently you will then have to tell me that this tax is imposed on the producers and that will increase the cost of production for the producers. So as a result, the supply will fall and the price of the fizzy drinks will increase. Now, please be very mindful, the price of the fizzy drinks that increase is the reason why there is a increase in the private cost of the consumers. That's why I highlighted over here. The whole private cost line is referring to the private cost of the consumers. So when the price of the fizzy drinks increase, that is also the reason why the private cost increase from MPC to MPCT. Okay, so when you are explaining, you also have to make sure you remember to make reference to the diagram. Alright, so I just want to emphasize to you, please do not merely copy and paste from the notes. You need to be able to contextualize and explain how taxation work. Okay, so when the private cost of the consumers increase, that is what we meant by consumers internalizing the external cost, because you are making the external cost part of their private cost. Okay, then you do not just stop there, you have to then further elaborate to me how with the taxation the private cost increase from MPC to MPCT and thereby having a new market equilibrium. So the new market equilibrium, if you look at the diagram, is in fact this particular point over here where your MPCT cuts your MPB. So it gives you the new market equilibrium after tax. Now at this market equilibrium, you realize that it coincides with the social optimal level QS, and that is how you correct the market failure. So when the quantity demanded fall from QM to QS, that's how you address the market failure. So this entire two-step A and B has to be present in your answers when you are explaining the whole taxation and how it addresses market failure. So this is important. Okay, so I don't want students to just copy and paste. I want students to be able to explain the whole process. So why is it that we can't say, because when you look at my comments, I will circle the NPC and then I ask you whose NPC is that. So you must be very mindful whose perspective are we looking at. So when you are attempting your next assignment or your test, you have to be very careful who are we looking at this issue from which lens. Okay, all right, so that's why this line where you say about how taxes increase the cost of production to producers and hence increase NPC to NPCT, I always ask you whose NPC is this. All right, so you have to be mindful of that. Okay, next, then we look at the limitations of tax. Many of you can tell me that the demand for fizzy drink is price inelastic, but the main thing that I want to know is why. Okay, why? So I need to see things like there is no close substitutes. So when there are no close substitutes, it becomes like a necessity to these people who are addicted to fizzy drinks. Now, I highlighted the word perceive is because it is a belief of these consumers that they are not willing to give up fizzy drinks, and they think that they will need it because it is like an essential item to them in their life, right? So and that's why I highlighted the word think and the perceived. Okay, so many of you, after talking about how the demand for drinks, for fizzy drink is price inelastic, the taxes have to be significantly high in order to reduce the quantity demanded, and therefore it's not a political viable option, which is good. I just want to highlight that maybe you want to consider adding this in the long run into your explanation, because what we want to see is that the government can impose a high tax, no problem. But the problem is when the public get used to these high taxes and high prices, consumption pattern will then remain more or less the same. So in order to really reduce the consumption level to QS, you need to ensure that these taxes have to keep the government have to keep raising the taxes in order for them to really reach to QS level. So that's why we are looking at in the long term, can the government keep on raising taxes in order for them to reach the QS level? So we already know that consumers are not so responsive to price changes. So if you tax them a little bit too little, they will not change their consumer behavior as much. But if you tax them too much, then you also will lose some political support as well. All right, so this thing that I mentioned, okay, about the demand that's being very price inelastic, a perceived necessity, this is also one of the reasons why you will need public education. In fact, in order to educate consumers to give up consumption of these unhealthy drinks, it is through educating them. So you want to tell them about the benefits and the cost, the real cost of consuming these unhealthy drinks and the benefit of healthy living on themselves. Okay, so that's why I mentioned over here, precisely because there's this perceived necessity. One big reason why taxation alone will not be able to get you to reach the QS level effectively. Okay, so that's why they cannot be the best anymore. All right, and actually the other bigger limitation in this example is in fact the difficulty in measuring the external cost accurately. So how do you really measure the loss of productivity in a workforce as a result of obesity and diabetes? You can't really put a money, a value to it, which will make the amount of taxation to impose. How do you calculate the amount of tax to impose? Okay, so I will come back to the part about public education in a bit. I just want to spend a bit of time to look at this whole idea of transiting. So not many of you actually talk about another policy, which I didn't ask you to, is okay. I just want to highlight something is that I don't want students to use the word another policy is the use of public education. I want you to erase this whole notion of another policy. No, you shouldn't be using that. I want you to try to add an argument or coherence to your answer by asking yourself, why is there really a need for other policy? So if there is a need for other policy, can that policy still be the best way then? Alright, so usually for other policies, they are playing more of a complementary role. That means you need a combination of A and B in order to reach the outcome effectively. So there is no real one policy that can be the best for both the short term and the long term. Okay, so I want you to try to use transitional phrases, so such as I've given you some examples over here. So in view of the limitations of text, there could be a need for, so the highlighted phrases like in view of and a need for. So these are phrases that you can replace the word another policy. Okay, or the other phrase that I mentioned over here, as text alone cannot reduce the consumption of fizzy drinks to QS level. So the word as and alone, so that's why you will need other policy to support. So when you use such transitional phrase, then you bring in the another policy. That would be a better flow in terms of your argument and the coherence in your answer, and not just everything is another policy, the second policy. So I hope you understand that in writing this kind of long answers, you need to be able, that's why I highlighted over here, the word here is argument, the coherence in your answer. So this is especially important when you are addressing questions like this. Okay, so this is also the reason why I link it back to the public education one, precisely because the demand for fizzy drink is very price inelastic. So you want to correct that kind of mindset, you want to correct that kind of mentality. So you need to be able to educate people to get them to change their tastes and preferences. This is also something that what the government is currently doing with the vaccination. In order to encourage people to take up the vaccination, they go out in trying to advertise, getting people to share stories, getting people to come up with advertisement and ambassadors, things like that. So you want to get them to educate that kind of mindset that vaccines are actually unsafe, to correct that kind of mindset. So similarly, what we want to do here is also to get consumers to correct that kind of mindset that fizzy drinks is the best, is the only essential thing that they have to consume. That they should be looking, the kind of public education should be looking at how there are other healthier alternatives out there to fizzy drinks. Okay, so that is the reason why when you transit to public education, you can use this limitation, this one that I'm highlighting over here, as the reason why you will need to have a complementary policy such as public education. Okay, so I will PDF this document and I will send to you together with the answers, and then I have another video that will summarize the structure that you should be adopting when you're answering this kind of best question. Okay, so that will be in your separate video. Okay, that's all from me. Thank you.